My name is Renata Voss. I'm 29, and I spent 6 years as a pharmacy technician before I became a wedding planner, which means I've spent more of my life reading drug labels than reading place cards. That training is the only reason I'm not in a hospital bed right now, or worse. I was standing in the bridal suite of the Whitlock estate, 20 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, holding a champagne flute my brother Desmond had personally carried up the stairs, so the bride doesn't have to lift a finger today. He'd never once in his life carried a drink for me. I looked at the faint cloudy swirl at the bottom of the glass, the kind that doesn't dissolve all the way, and every year of pharmacy training I'd ever had screamed at me before my brain even caught up. I didn't drink it. I didn't confront him. I smiled, thanked him, and set it down on the vanity. 40 minutes later, in front of 200 guests, my brother's plan didn't just fail. It detonated in his hands, and the only person who ended up unconscious on my wedding day was him. Welcome back to where ordinary women face impossible families and answer them with a steady voice instead of a raised one. If you've ever had someone smile at you while planning your downfall, you're in the right place. Drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe, because this story starts with a glass of champagne and ends with paramedics at a 5-star venue. Let me back up about 4 months, because the glass didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a will. My father died in February. He built a small chain of regional pharmacies from nothing, 3 locations across 2 counties, and in the will he split the business 60-40. 60 to me, because I was the one who'd actually worked the counter since I was 17, who'd gotten licensed, who'd kept the books straight during the 2 years he was sick. 40 to Desmond, who'd worked there for exactly 1 summer before deciding retail wasn't his path, and who'd spent the years since drifting between failed business ideas funded by money he didn't have. I want to be clear that I didn't ask for 60%. My father decided that on his own, and he told me why before he died, sitting in a hospital bed with an IV in his arm, and more clarity than the doctors expected him to have left. Desmond will spend it, he said. You'll grow it. I'm not choosing a favorite, Ren. I'm choosing a future. I held his hand and told him I understood. And I meant it, and I also understood immediately that Desmond would never see it that way. I was right. The will reading happened on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Desmond was telling our mother that I'd manipulated Dad at the end, and that the will should be contested. By the following week, he'd hired a lawyer to look into it, a fact I only learned because the lawyer's assistant called my office by mistake, trying to schedule what she called the Voss inheritance consultation, and reading off my own cell number from what was apparently Desmond's contact list. I didn't say anything. I just wrote the date and her name in a notebook I'd started keeping, the same notebook my father used to keep behind the pharmacy counter, the one where he wrote down anything that needed remembering exactly, because memory is cheap and documentation is expensive only once. The contest went nowhere. Wills written by a man with full mental capacity, 2 doctor's notes confirming it, and a notarized signature don't get overturned because a disappointed son feels slighted. Desmond's lawyer told him as much, apparently, because by April the legal threats stopped and something quieter started instead. He started showing up. Not at the pharmacies, where he had no reason to be. But at my apartment, at my engagement dinner, at my fiancé Theo's family barbecue. Always warm, always charming, always telling people how proud he was of his little sister. Theo liked him immediately. That's the thing about charming people who are planning something. They're charming to everyone except the one person who already knows better. He's trying too hard, I told Theo one night in May, after Desmond had spent an entire dinner praising my business instincts to Theo's parents. He's grieving your dad and trying to reconnect, Theo said. Maybe let him. I didn't argue. Theo hadn't grown up watching Desmond smile at our mother while quietly emptying her purse for gas money that never made it to a gas tank. Theo saw a grieving brother. I saw a man circling. The wedding planning moved forward through the spring. Theo and I had been together 4 years, engaged for 1, and we'd settled on a September date at the Whitlock estate, an old converted vineyard property 40 minutes outside the city. 200 guests. My mother on one side of the aisle alone, since my father couldn't be there. Desmond asked to be a groomsman. I said yes, because saying no would have started a war. I didn't have the bandwidth to fight 3 months before my own wedding. And because some small, stupid, hopeful part of me wanted to believe my father might have been wrong about him, just this once. In July, Desmond asked me a question that should have told me everything. We were having coffee, one of the rare one-on-one conversations he'd requested since the funeral, and he asked, very casually, stirring his cup longer than necessary, whether the pharmacy shares were liquid. Whether I could sell my portion if I wanted to. Whether, hypothetically, if something happened to me, the business would automatically pass to Theo, or back to him, or how exactly that worked. Why are you asking? I said. Just estate planning brain, he said. Dad's death made me think about this stuff. I told him, truthfully, that my will left everything to Theo, with the business reverting to family ownership only if Theo predeceased me too, which would mean it went to Desmond by default in that scenario. I watched something settle behind his eyes when I said that. At the time I told myself it was relief that the business would stay in the family no matter what. Looking back, I think it was the moment he found his answer to a question he'd been quietly working through for months. What happens to the 60% if his sister isn't around to hold it? I'm not saying he planned to kill me. I want to be precise about this, because precision is what eventually mattered. I believe, and the police eventually came to believe, that what Desmond wanted was simpler and almost more insulting. He wanted me incapacitated, embarrassed, and unable to function on the one day everyone who mattered to my business and my marriage would be watching me. A bride who collapses at her own wedding, who's rushed out in an ambulance, who becomes the subject of whispered concern about her health and her judgment. That bride becomes, very quickly, a liability. A business partner people start to worry about. A sister people start to feel sorry for, instead of someone they trust to run 3 pharmacies. I think he wanted me weak enough, publicly enough, that the next conversation about the business wouldn't be about the will anymore. It would be about whether I was stable enough to keep my 60% at all. I didn't know any of this consciously on the morning of the wedding. What I knew was smaller and simpler. My brother carried a champagne flute up 2 flights of stairs himself, past 3 caterers who could have done it, set it down in front of me with a speech about how he wanted to be the one to give you your first toast as a married woman, and the liquid in that flute had a faint cloudiness at the bottom that champagne does not have. 6 years behind a pharmacy counter teaches you things you can't unlearn. You learn what crushed pills look like when they don't fully dissolve. You learn the particular non-effervescent stillness of a liquid that's had something added to it after the bubble's already settled. None of this was conscious reasoning in the moment. It was just my hands not picking up the glass, and a cold, clean certainty arriving before any thought did. I set the flute down on the vanity, behind my makeup bag, where it wouldn't get bumped or rinsed by a well-meaning bridesmaid. Then I asked my maid of honor, Priya, who has known me since we were 12 and who does not ask follow-up questions when I use a certain tone of voice, to do exactly 2 things. First, photograph the glass exactly where it sat, several angles, with her phone's timestamp visible. Second, find my coordinator, Marisol, and ask her quietly to hold that exact flute aside, untouched, for the toast presentation, which was a lie. Marisol didn't question because brides ask for strange things on their wedding day and nobody blinks. I did not call the police. Not yet. I want to explain why, because I know how that sounds. I had no proof of anything except a cloudy glass and a brother with a documented financial motive and a documented pattern of resentment. If I called the police at that moment, the most likely outcome was a report filed, a wedding derailed, and a glass that would need to go to a lab for testing that wouldn't come back for days or weeks. My wedding would become the wedding where the bride accused her brother of poisoning her, with no confirmed evidence yet, in front of 200 people, half of whom worked with my father for decades, and would take sides before any test results existed. So instead, I did what 6 years of inventory audits and 3 years of watching my father handle pharmacy theft cases had taught me. I documented quietly. I preserved evidence, and I let the situation play out toward whatever Desmond had actually planned, because if he'd gone to this much trouble, he wasn't going to stop with one untouched glass. A man who plans this carefully has a contingency. His contingency arrived 20 minutes later, in the form of a second flute. I came downstairs for photos. Desmond met me at the bottom of the staircase, and this time he wasn't holding anything himself. He waved over one of the roaming servers, a young man named Caleb, who I'd later learn had been told by Desmond before the ceremony, that my sister loves a mimosa right before she walks. It's a tradition. Just bring her one when you see her coming down. Caleb, who had no idea he was being used, handed me a mimosa with the same genuinely warm smile servers give brides all day. I took it, thanked him by name because Marisol had given the staff list to me the week before, and I make a point of knowing people's names, and I did not drink it either. I held it. I smiled for photos holding a glass I had no intention of finishing, and the entire time, Priya stood 11 feet away with her phone in her clutch, recording nothing in particular, just present, just a witness with a working camera. The ceremony itself was, against every odd, beautiful. I walked down the aisle on my mother's arm since my father couldn't, and when I caught Desmond's eye in the groomsmen's row, he smiled at me. The exact same easy smile he'd had since we were children, and for one disorienting second, I almost let myself believe none of it was real, that pharmacy instinct could be wrong, that grief makes people see threats that aren't there. Then I remembered the cloudy swirl at the bottom of a glass that didn't get that way on its own, and I kept walking. It was at the reception, during the toasts, that his plan exploded, not metaphorically, not in some dramatic confrontation I staged, but literally, because of a mistake he made that had nothing to do with me at all. Desmond stood up to give the best man's toast, the role he'd asked for months earlier alongside being a groomsman, and he was holding a glass of his own. Champagne, like everyone else's except his, had come from a different source than the rest of the head tables. A fact I only pieced together afterward. He'd apparently prepared 2 doctored glasses that morning using the same substance, intending to give one to me and keep a second one nearby, in case the first attempt failed. Perhaps planning to switch it later in the evening if I hadn't been incapacitated yet. What he hadn't planned for was Caleb, the same server who'd unknowingly delivered my untouched mimosa, clearing glasses from the staging table where Desmond had left his spare drink sitting for nearly 40 minutes while he mingled. Caleb, doing his job exactly as trained, saw an abandoned glass, assumed it was finished, and poured its remaining contents, along with several other abandoned glasses, into a pitcher used for refilling drinks at the family table during the toasts, a practice the catering company used to reduce the number of trips back to the bar station. Desmond drank from that pitcher himself 20 minutes later, thirsty from talking, without checking what he was pouring. I didn't see him take it. I only saw the result. Midway through his own toast, the one where he was telling 200 people how proud our father would be of this day, his words started slowing down in a way that had nothing to do with emotion. His eyes lost focus. He swayed once, caught the edge of the table, and then his glass slipped out of his hand and shattered on the floor, and he went down with it, not violently, just a slow collapse, the kind that happens when a body's muscles stop responding to instructions. The room went from applause to screaming in about 4 seconds. Paramedics were already contracted for the event, a standard precaution at large outdoor venues, and they reached him in under 2 minutes. He was breathing. He was unconscious. At the hospital, his blood work came back showing a significant dose of flunitrazepam, a powerful sedative with no business being in anyone's bloodstream at a wedding, let alone the best man's. Here is where the part I'd been quietly documenting since the bridal suite mattered more than I expected it to. When the detective assigned to the case asked routine questions about anything unusual that day, I didn't lead with an accusation. I simply handed her my phone, with Priya's time-stamped photos of the untouched flute, still sitting exactly where I'd left it behind my makeup bag. The mimosa I'd never finished, still sitting on a side table where I'd set it down for photos. Both glasses recovered and bagged by venue staff before cleanup at my specific instruction. I told her, calmly, what I'd noticed about the cloudiness, what my professional background was, and why I'd chosen to preserve evidence rather than make accusations with no proof. The lab results came back 9 days later. Both of my abandoned drinks tested positive for the same sedative found in Desmond's blood. The flunitrazepam in all 3 samples matched, down to a specific inactive binding compound used by only a handful of manufacturers, one of which happened to supply a pharmacy 2 counties over where Desmond had, 6 weeks earlier, used an old employee badge that hadn't been deactivated to access a restricted storage room for inventory help. During a staffing shortage, the badge logs still had his entry time stamped. The inventory count from that storage room came up short exactly 1 bottle. A fact nobody had flagged because nobody was looking for it, until a detective started asking pharmacies in the area very specific questions about a very specific drug. He was charged with 2 counts of attempted poisoning, 1 for me, technically, even though I never ingested anything, because the law in our state counts the act of administering a controlled substance with intent to harm regardless of whether the victim consumes it, and 1 additional charge for the unintended consumption by the catering staff who'd handled the contaminated pitcher, 2 of whom also tested positive for trace amounts and were treated as additional victims, including poor Caleb, who'd had no idea he'd been used as the unwitting delivery system for his own employer's near poisoning. My mother did not believe it at first. I want to include this honestly, because it's the part that hurt the most, more than the glass, more than the hospital, more than the ruined photos from a wedding day that should have just been about Theo and me. She sat across from me 3 weeks after the wedding and told me I must be misunderstanding something, that her son wouldn't do this, that maybe I'd set something up out of resentment over the will. I let her finish. Then I told her, very calmly, that the lab results existed independent of anything I said or felt, that the badge logs existed independent of my feelings, that none of this required her to believe me, only to look at evidence that didn't care whether any of us believed it. She looked at the lab report for a long time. She didn't apologize that day. She did, eventually, 3 months later, in a phone call where her voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it, and I accepted the apology the way I've learned to accept most things now, carefully, without rebuilding anything on top of it that doesn't deserve a foundation. Desmond pled guilty rather than face trial. Once the lab results, the badge logs, and Priya's photographs made the outcome obvious to even his own lawyer. He received 18 months, most of it suspended in favor of mandatory treatment and probation, since no one was permanently harmed, and his own poor planning meant he ended up the only person actually sedated that day. I didn't push for harsher. I didn't need to. The 40% of the pharmacy business that would have come to him eventually, through inheritance or goodwill or simple family obligation, is now held in a trust that requires my approval to access, set up by lawyers in the weeks after the wedding. The kind of document that doesn't punish anyone but simply makes sure nothing like this can ever pay off again. Theo and I postponed the honeymoon by exactly 1 week, long enough for the worst of the legal chaos to settle, and then we went anyway, because I refused to let 1 more day of my life get rearranged around my brother's choices. I think about the cloudy glass sometimes, not with fear anymore, just with a strange kind of clarity. The same clarity I felt holding it in my hand 20 minutes before I was supposed to become someone's wife. It taught me something I didn't expect a wedding day to teach me, that the people who plan to hurt you rarely plan as carefully as they think they do, and that the habit of paying attention, of noticing what doesn't look right even when everyone around you insists it's fine, is not paranoia. It's just a kind of literacy. I'd spent 6 years reading labels for a living. I just never expected to need that skill at my own reception. Reading the one label that mattered most, the look on my brother's face when he handed me a drink, he never expected me to set back down. That's my story. A cloudy glass, a badge that should have been deactivated, and a picture meant for me that found its way back to him instead. If you've ever had someone smile at you while planning something underneath the smile, let this be your sign to trust the part of you that notices before you have proof. You don't need certainty to protect yourself. You just need attention. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling me what you'd have done with that glass, and hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.